Hello, I'm Stuart Pallister, former journalist and editor turned communications practitioner in higher education. Welcome to Leading Hospitality Through Turbulent Times. This series is entitled The World After 2020, and we're now on to part 3. We're halfway through the course, over the hump. The session will last about 1 hour. We'll have questions about halfway through and questions again at the end. But we'll be taking questions in writing only, and you can submit these via the chat function as we go along. And before we start, just a reminder once again that the session will be recorded and will be available on the Moodle platform afterwards. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Yves Schemeil, who specializes in global and comparative politics. Professor Schemeil.
Thank you, Stuart. Welcome back to you all. And this time we are in part 3, which will occupy us for 2 weeks. Let me sum up what we have learned so far very briefly. We have underlined the difficulties to forecast the future and draw lessons from the past in 2 activities which are cognitively quite demanding. We have described the contradictory relationships between states on the one hand and international organizations on the other hand. We have a good example of that today or yesterday, because Donald Trump said that this time the United States would be out of the World Health Organization because they didn't reform quickly, which they could not anyway in a couple of weeks. We have described these contradictory relationships, and we have shown that some had an impact on the hospitality industry. We also evaluated variations of stakeholders' assets and capacity to anticipate in the race to recover from the current crisis. We are not equal in trying to manage this crisis and to find exit from it in the near future. We have shown that the international organizations are making norms, that they write report about the countries which are members of this organization. They lobby, especially those which are made of business associations, etc. And we also have observed that classical diplomacy and ways to negotiate are now in a way declining. What we are going to do from now on, we are going to review the changes in the global architecture of the world, which has been presented to you last week. To explain what happened in 2020, and if we can reach an accurate diagnosis, there are quite a number of things that we have to go through. So let's see what exactly happened in 2019, 2020. Well, this is the birth of an uncertain world. Why? Because, you know, for decades, people took for granted that we were living in a society where progress would be constant, that we will improve our conditions of life and health, etc., forever. So it was the path towards growth and more growth, etc. Now, there are people who think that we could regress, or some even say that we should regress. We should go for a degrowth. Science now is powerless against a certain type of enemies like this virus, and there are people who are arguing that we should live in a very, very humble way with low-key needs, etc., and that these people are empowered by now. Well, the answer is that what happened in 2020, we do not know yet, because it takes time to make science, whereas the times to make politics is very short. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that we have data, we have many data, we have an abundance of data, But these data are quite inconsistent with each other. I mean, this is the first time that we have this debate about, if there is a test, and is the test scientific? Is it matching the standards of epistemology, the science which says what is scientific and what is not, etc. And people are doubting a lot that some physicians and people who are in the medical sciences and do research publish good article in the best journals of the world. So if we try to understand the crisis or not misunderstand it, what we find out is that if we don't understand it because we lack knowledge, because the virus is recent and because the actually infectious disease were not the target of high quality scientific research in the past decades. We lack also expertise. The consensus on the policy measures to take is among medical experts is very uneasy to reach. I mean, they are arguing and there are dissenting opinions within the scientific councils which are advising policy makers. And advising policymakers is becoming more and more of a challenge. We also lack information. We see at the very beginning of the crisis that time to collect this information, to understand what it meant, to pass this information to other countries and to the World Health Organization was very long, too long compared to the emergency. In Wuhan, they knew things like this in November, and I have recently heard from people who are in medical sciences that in France, in September, there were cases of this new coronavirus which were identified, and it took a long period of time to understand exactly what this virus was about, where it came from, etc. Too long, actually. And sometimes the chain of knowledge has been broken because the local authorities, for example, were trying to screen, scan, review the information before passing them to the top authorities in their country, as was the case in China. We also lack confidence in everything, in the data, confidence in the people who process the data, and also because of the cognitive biases that we have examined earlier. There are a number of dangers which are not considered as alarming or as alarming enough to take emergency measures. And the data or the information that we received was part of the time considered in a number of countries as not being full and sincere, honest, to say the least. And all this combined, of course, makes very difficult to take stock on science. If we look at these graphs, we have a pretty good idea of what's happening actually and why we don't understand fully what's happening. Look at the number of excess deaths compared to an ordinary year at the same time in the year, May 18, for example, or April 26 for France. We have twice as many excess deaths in the United Kingdom, 67% excess deaths, compared to France, 33%. And as you see, you may find all the data, and I show you some. There is greater trust in the government, confidence in the government in the UK than in France. If you compare now Sweden to France, Sweden was for a while put on top of the countries which succeeded in containing the epidemic. And you see that's quite nearly the same ratio of excess deaths in Sweden and in France, 30% against 23%. But again, the confidence in the government in Sweden is much higher than in France. So there is a puzzle here, and it's very, very difficult to solve that puzzle. We want to know why some governments are trusted by the nationals, why others are not, because there doesn't seem to be a quite logical explanation. For me, as a political scientist, I don't see clearly what are the factors which explain the differences between confidence and the success or failure in handling this pandemic. Because we have successful governments which are not trusted and successful ones which are trusted. I give you the example of France, which is of course the one I know best. We are sure by now that the 60,000 lives at the very least have been spared by the lockdown measures taken by the governments rather early on, not as early as they should have done, but as rather early on compared to the UK, which was very late, lagging behind the schedule it should have adopted. But if we look for what happened in other countries, it's a little difficult to understand fully. On this graph, what you see is the opinion of national citizens in polls in various countries of the world. And you see that the Australian are probably, with somehow the people in Singapore, the only one who think that the crisis has been handled efficiently. And possibly for these two countries, I mean, it's a subjective belief, but it's also an objective fact. Now, in China, as you see, there are a lot of critics about what happened, whereas because of the political condition of this country, it's not quite sure that this means a lack of confidence or absolute confidence in the government, and even less demand for a change of the ways countries is governed. In the United Kingdom too, I mean, it's badly evaluated, but we know that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, possibly because he was himself ill, is always popular, still popular, or was popular at the time of this graph. In Italy, they handled the crisis much better than expected, but because they were the first to be shocked by this pandemic in Europe, because it was so tough in Milano and the region of Lombardia, and actually quite a number who think by now that the Italian government did a lot of good work, and confidence is that government is increasing. But what you see here is that it doesn't actually match with the idea that the Italians have about how the crisis was handled. And the United States, I mean, no comment. Now, if you think about the confidence in the government in a number of countries, which is a structural fact, I mean, independently of the coronavirus crisis, but also in the context of the corona crisis, what you see is that Germany is actually much better ranked than Italy, but Italy is still better appreciated than the UK, and the USA are the last in the queue. If you want to understand why is it so, and why it seems so complicated, actually difficult to understand, and if we look at the way this crisis was handled, country by country, we don't find any satisfying explanation, because there were countries in which the lockdown was decided very early on, but they had reached a very dissimilar performance, like Germany compared to the three Latin countries, Italy, Spain, and France. If you take Lebanon, for example, it handled the crisis quite well, but Iran did not as well as Lebanon, although, of course, the figures we have about Iran may be a little underestimated by now. There are countries in which the lockdown was late and quite unequal, depending on the regions and the city, etc., like China, which succeed in a way compared to the UK, the US, and Brazil, in which São Paulo had the lockdown, but not other parts of the country. And in the end, I mean, the outcomes of the crisis in these countries are not comparable. There are countries where there was no lockdown, but protective wear and testing and tracing were adopted, like Taiwan and Japan. Very few death toll in Japan, 830 something today, versus Korea, which was applauded for doing a lot of good jobs or not, but with quite a number of people which were impacted by the virus. And Norway and Finland didn't do much, but they had very few cases, whereas Sweden, which was on the same line, is very much affected, much more than France by now, actually, in proportion to the population. So this would, per se, lead people to think that they should refrain from making forecasts and being very authoritative in telling what's going to happen. But actually, they do make guesses. This is the one of the latest opinion poll that we have. Given all that we know by now, but little, about the current corona situation, what should the politicians have done differently? So, in retrospect, we are going to judge what was how good or bad was the policy in our country. In general, most countries says acted faster, and then isolated more, and then the last concern seems to be supported jobs and the economy. Whereas I'm sure that we all think, when we are looking at this graph, that the economy should be on an equal footing with health issues, which apparently is not the case. And you see that difference in living in different countries doesn't make much of a difference about the priority order of these concerns. So we are left with this question, what is the actual explanatory factor, if there is one? Probably a combination of factors, but if we are looking for the most important one, what it would be? Physical distancing, mask, testing, tracing, etc. Quite a number of measures which have been in use everywhere in the world, or nearly everywhere in the world, alternatively or simultaneously. And among them, there is the question of the age structure of the population, because, of course, in countries where 75% of the inhabitants are under 35, assuming that very few people above 35 die from the disease, this is another issue, the more so when these countries are southerly enough to be protected in a way from something which seems to strike more the countries of the north. Even in Europe, Greece is much less impacted than Spain is, for example, which is difficult to understand. And there are people who also said that weather could play a part in this explanation, because infectious diseases are related to the temperature and to the condition of humidity, etc. But the answer is not easy. And what comes out from this so much incertitude is that we have an impression of greater vulnerability than when we thought that progress, scientific progress and the technological progress, which bring us from the very dark past to a bright future. People now do not feel protected against risk and threat as they felt that they were in the past. And confidence toward knowledgeable decision makers and their advisors is somewhat lost. Not everywhere, but on average, it seems that the relationship between the elites who think and make decisions and those who are just informed about what the decisions are and what are the rationales behind these decisions, this is a big gap now, bigger gap than in the past. So what did politicians learn from the crisis? They learned something very, very important. You know that in the general public, when we are looking for what is the mood of a politician, what he or she has in mind in an ordinary day, we never think of this, that each decision that we make had consequences. Some are, of course, expected and desirable, and some are unexpected and desirable. Among these outcomes which are undesirable, the fact that a number of people could be badly affected and some could simply die. For example, if you decide to open a lane for a bus in a city and it goes in the other way against the lane on which cars are expected to drive, And the first weeks you do this, there are a number of people who are just killed by buses. So when you are in a city hall and you make that decision, you never think that you are going to kill children, the elderly in numbers. But this happens everywhere because, of course, people are not prepared to see buses coming from the wrong direction. So in the crisis, the coronavirus crisis, whatever the decision makers decided, well, they had big, unexpected and undesirable consequences. And so, you know, it's really complex to decide at some point that you will go into that direction, knowing now that there are a number of impediments if you do this compared to going in the other direction. So 2020 may be considered as the birth of an uncertain world where governments and intergovernmental organizations are not quite sure that they can handle such crises and they will handle them in the future. So there is a big anxiety about how the future will bring as surprises and how we can hopefully overcome these difficulties in the future. You know, in the past, it was easy to contain the impact of pandemic, for example, using the technique of sanitary belts, and you just cut off a piece of land on the map, and so you decide that those people who are there cannot go out. This is what happened in Wuhan, actually. And if you cannot do this, you can transfer or delegate to an existing IO like the WHO the responsibility to solve the issue, and that will be by the government enough time to find out ways to fight this pandemic better in the second wave or third wave or whatever. But we don't think that we have time by now. We think that the emergency is here, and so we are doubting of what were the recipes for success in the past. So let's start with the problem that we are facing by now, which is rather specific for various reasons. First, because there are now 7 major challenges that we are confronted to, and these major challenges, like here at tsunami in Japan, actually, this is a catastrophe, it's a disaster, but there are quite a number of existing challenges, like earthquake and fires and whatever. But these 7 major challenges are actually a little new. And the fact that we are now facing this pandemic just by now doesn't mean that health is an absolute priority, and was and still and will be again an absolute priority. There is, of course, an absolute urgency to recover from this crisis in the hospitality business, because at the very least people must feel safe to travel, but there is an increasing number of challenges that we have to face. Some of these challenges are impacting hospitality more than others. If you take urban pollution, for example, generated by fossil fuel like coal or oil, etc., it can make visits to some world landmarks very unhealthy. I'll give you an example in a minute. But whatever the dramatic impression we get from movies or photographs of such landmarks in a very bad condition, hospitality as such cannot be a priority in times of disaster. I mean, there are other priorities like saving lives, and it's not only like having people traveling safe, but it's also about having people remaining alive. So the best we can hope for the hospitality industry is that there will be an adequate mitigation of other risks. So at some point, we will be able, and governments will be able to focus on things which are more mattering to people who are in this sector than any other. In recent years, these new challenges the 7 new plagues of our time have been added to the old challenges we know: natural disasters, starvation, war, intolerance, deforestation, etc. The new challenges are not fully new, but suddenly we feel that they are much more acute. Actually, they are plaguing us much more than in the past. These are the 7 woes of the world. Of course, it's a paraphrase of 7 woes of Egypt from the Bible. Climate change, the environment, wastes, epidemics, terrorism, migration, and inequalities. Taming any of this challenge is, of course, a great achievement if we can reach that point, but at the same time, it can boost another challenge. So, for example, if you opt for nuclear energy, it slows down the greenhouse effects and has a big positive impact on climate change, but it also increases toxic wastes that have a negative impact on the environment. Underpaid migrants, for example, make the business model of restaurants, hotels, etc., viable, but it may also increase terrorism if a number of these illegal migrants are coming from countries in which there is a civil war and terrorist attacks are very frequent. So let's review the challenge one by one. Starting with climate change. The cause of climate change are debatable, and a number of scientists are not completely agreeing on the causes which come from human activity and other causes like more natural or even from the outer space, etc. But the facts are there, and whatever the estimate is and wherever it comes from, if you compare the International Energy Agency, it's considered pro-business. If you take the IPCC, it's considered unbiased and neutral. Well, the prospects and forecasts are quite similar. This, I guess, doesn't need any comment. We see that it's something which objectively exists and will impact human life more and more in the future. So what can we do? We can try to slow down the rate of climate change, but we will not reverse its potentially harmful trends because it's beyond our reach, or we can prepare for the worst. The question is either of these 2 solutions feasible? This is something we cannot answer, and a question we cannot answer easily, because there is a dilemma. Big countries that matter for the world economy are not prepared to sacrifice their standards of living, their way of life, to save the inhabitants of microstates like the Fijis, the Tuvalu. It's probably going to drown in the future, or peripheral regions of the world like Bhutan or Nepal or etc. And they are not even prepared to rescue the populations of more important countries like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, etc., and African countries, which are actually countries in which you have fragile states. The climate change is actually a complex issue because it has multiple impacts. There is an impact on weather, on tourism, on migration, and then again on mobility. This makes the world changing dramatically the type of habits that we had when we were looking at people who were mobile and moved from one country to another. Now, second issue, the environment. Well, if we first focus on clean air, which is probably an important thing we have to breathe everywhere, and each of us, can we limit the pollution of clean air? There are industrial emissions and they decrease, but coal plants do not close everywhere as promised because the government pledged to close these coal plants. In Germany, for example, we have to wait until 2028, and probably in 2030 they will cut off their emissions by half. But phasing out coal energy takes a lot of time everywhere. if we, the only thing we are sure of is that in the long run, coal will continue to decline. Here we have a very telling graph where during Obama mandate, you see how the phasing out of coal was effective, but it's still the case under Trump, who committed himself to restore the industry and said that we have a big, beautiful, clean coal. If this motto could help the industry in the long run. In Germany, this is not a problem. I mean, everyone has now reached a point where the coal's demise is considered inevitable. Now, if we look at the impact of air pollution on tourism, this, and not only air pollution, but also water pollution, what we see here is what the Taj Mahal in India, which is supposed to be one of the most beautiful landmarks in the world and touristic venue, is becoming, at least at time of the year or time of the day. And this pollution is a pollution which has been identified. We know the sources, but I mean, nothing is done in order to restore the this fantastic, I am talking like Trump by now, this fantastic monument. Now, if you look at what are the cities which are much more plagued than others by air pollution, you see that they are all in the global south. I mean, most of these cities, some of us at the very least don't even know where they are. If we had no flag and country name in the column next to the name of the city, we would be unaware of what's happening there, but it's happening at a high pace, increasingly dangerous, as you can see, and probably Nigeria is a champion, worldwide champion, but I mean, for the worse. And of course, the problem is that there are many sources of air pollution, as you can see here, which makes countries unequal compared to the pollution that the inhabitants are facing, which is absolutely not the same in the Middle West, in the United States compared to the East Coast, and even the West Coast is much better off. Third challenge, toxic waste and damaging pests as well. A very interesting list which was drawn by UNEP, the United Nations Programme for the Environment, which prohibited the number of components, 12 persistent organic pollutants, and the members of UNEP called them the 12 bastards. And you have a list here, and if you read the list carefully, it's actually frightening. There are also toxic ores and chemicals, which are sometimes not in the list, like lead, cadmium, and mercury, and many others. And there is a whole unit of UNEP which works on the enhancing the list in Geneva by now. You also have damaging pests like plant killers and the crickets waves we have seen very recently in Eastern Africa, but there are also bacillus and the phylloxera in vineyards in Burgundy or in the south of France, plus the vectors of usual vectors of tropical diseases, tiger mosquito, which actually travel north, and we find tiger mosquito in Switzerland by now, which was completely unexpected, let's say 5 years ago. Fourth challenge, pandemics and epidemics, by the way, not only pandemic. There are numerous vectors of infectious diseases. The wild animals and domestic cattle can be, in a way, sources of big disasters in matters of health. And there are also, we are used to viruses and we are used to bacteria, but there are viruses which are super viruses like the coronavirus that we are now facing. There are prions, the ones which were the roots of the mad cow disease. They had not completely disappeared. They disappeared because measures were taken, like not feeding the animals with their own meat. But in the long run, we don't know if it's not going to come back. Now, Stuart, if you want to make a pause.
There are a couple of questions, but I think it might be better to deal with them towards the end, because one is about SARS, one is about overpopulation.
Okay, so we're going to see this. Yes, yeah. You're right.
Okay.
So, okay, let's go. The fifth challenge is terrorism and mass murders that we have seen in the United States, in schools and in hotels, mosques, etc. Christchurch in New Zealand. The statistics are indubitable. Political mass murders are on the right everywhere. You can see the graph on the right. And so the number of deaths, for example, in red is actually very impressive. Now, if we look at the world map of terrorism, which is updated nearly every 2 or 5 years, because they have to collect all the data and process them before mapping the events. We have on the map in orange, you have everything which is considered as an act before 1999, and then from 2020 to 2015, but it didn't change much after the French attacks in Paris, it's in red. And this is how it looks like. This is actually an interactive map. If you go to Google and find this map, then you see that you can have a look at the orange and the evolution of the orange spotted zones on the map, and then you can also switch to the red zones and see how it evolved in time. But I mean, the results is very striking, except for a region where there is nature above all. In the center of Australia, the Amazonia, in Canada, and Siberia, etc., the Sahara, probably in Iceland. You see that there are very few places in the world which have been spared by violence of this intensity. Attacks stigmatizing people and killing them because of what they are, not because of what they have done. And the novelty by now is the fact that due to the social networks, the internet and smartphones, the capacity that we have with our smartphones to videotape something at the moment it happens. As one of my friends told me on the phone yesterday, if I may use a personal anecdote, he said, "What's the first time in my life that I assist to a murder online, live, with the murder by a policeman of a black suspect in Minneapolis, Floyd." So that happened in front of the very eyes of anyone who was online at the time, or who could be online, who was online at the time. So this is what I could call murder by proxy, and it's made possible, or even in a way made more terrible, by hate speech. Hate speech is a new concept. I mean, we always were faced with speeches which were heinous enough against a category of people, etc. At the time of Hitler, people did not exactly knew what hate speech was, but I mean, they knew what was hate speech. And hate speech by now is something which is considered by legal text as having some sort of a specificity. And the specificity is exactly what I said. I mean, it's when you point out people and stigmatize them for what they are, like, if they are colored people, if they are belonging to one particular specific religion, etc. They must be this or that. It does not depend of their commitment to the welfare and the good deeds. It's just that they are considered as a whole, as belonging to people who could be erased from this earth, for example, which was the temptation that the Nazis had with the Jews. The lifetimes, so it's murder by proxy and it's hate speech. The lifetimes, the lifestyle and the mindsets of the upper classes or the upper middle classes, actually this category is even more targeted than the former one, because they are more numerous and they are more visible. They are targeted by all those who are tempted to use these mass murders in a way or another. So it's against growth, it's against welfare, it's against progress, it's against everything which can be enjoyable or look enjoyable for people who are deprived of it or would like to be able to benefit from it. 6 is uncontrolled migration. Again, the evidence is impressive, and by uncontrolled migration, I include non-legal migrations, and migration which has not been accepted according to legal texts in the countries where the migrants try to settle, and also every kind of trafficking of human beings which try to take them from one bank of the Mediterranean to another, for example. Since 2015, we had this very massive influx of refugees from Syria, and then Myanmar, and the people who were Rohingya and who were pushed by the action of the Burman army to go to Bangladesh. But also the Venezuela case is interesting, because at some point millions of people left Venezuela to neighboring countries like French Guiana, Brazil, Colombia, etc. And the Central American countries, which are the route of the famous caravan spotted by Donald Trump as being a threat to the American way of life, the people who just cross Mexico and try to pass to the United States, and had to, of course, to cross the wall, the fence, the separation fence between the United States and Mexico. But there are also countries which are plagued by a civil war, in which the West countries themselves have been involved. So in a way, we are responsible for this type of war. We are not responsible for what happened in Syria and Venezuela, but we are in Myanmar, but we are responsible for what happened in Afghanistan, Sudan, and Libya. Then we have been very much involved, and at some point we even triggered the beginning of a story of massive migration, which now has a lot of impact on us. But surprise, if you look at the countries from which the migrants, illegal migrants come from, especially in Europe, you see that they are not countries in which you have a civil war, not countries in which there is a violence of high intensity. These are countries like Albania and Eritrea, and some countries in the center of Africa. And the reason for that is because people who actually take this decision, makes this decision illegally with all the dangers that are associated to such a trip, are not those who are the most threatened, the most uneducated, and the poorest, as people usually think. And they think that if you are very poor and you don't have degrees, then you have no way to be recruited in your own country. And so the only thing that is open to you is to try to go to London, for example, and find a job in a rare kitchen there. But that's not the case. I mean, those who may actually afford to start this very long journey towards either Europe or North America are people who have money, invest in this. And the reason why they do this, now we have a lot of data about this type of migration. The reason why they do this, apart from the case where there is a big civil war, like in Syria, and people are afraid that their children are going to die or be handicapped and crippled for the rest of their life. But apart from these cases, they think that there is no future in their own country for their kids. So they want to send their kids elsewhere when they are much well prepared to to find jobs and to live a good life. So the people who do this often come from middle classes. They are young, they are in good health, and they deliberately opt to make a living elsewhere than in their home country. These people are employable, of course. They have a working value, and especially in health and hospitality. Take the United Kingdom and Germany, for example. Quite a number of doctors and nurses, personnel of hospital staff, etc., are foreign-born. And in the UK, 28% were foreign-trained in 2019 during the COVID crisis. There were a number of papers and columns showing how courageous and useful were these people who mainly came from the Indias, actually, in Great Britain, and who helped the National Health Service to fight with some efficiency the pandemic. In the UK, again, the people who are in health and high skills are the highest share of non-EU workers in Great Britain, 17%. That means that 1 out of 6 physicians or surgeons in a hospital, the public hospitals in Great Britain, might be an Indian. Now, in the UK, in the hospitality, it's the same kind of situation, 12% to 25%, depending on the type of calculus, sectors, etc., are EU citizens. That means more than 60,000 people in 2016, when the time Brexit was decided. Other nationalities can be as present as 1 out of 4 in some occupations, like people who are handling surgery department in a hospital, in a regional, provincial hospital. And the reasons for that are solid reasons. I mean, it's not only a matter of conjuncture, a crisis, and it's just going to disappear with time. If you look at this graph, you see that when people who are running hospitality businesses are asked if Brexit happened, what could they do to replace the workers coming from other European Union countries by British? Could they do that? Well, those who can do it completely are less than 10%. And those who can not do it on a very small extent are 40%. That means that whatever the Brexit will be, they will have a problem in the hospitality business in the UK. And the reason why they cannot recruit national workers and they have to go for foreign ones is because, as usual, there is a lack of interest for this type of jobs among nationals, and that's true in France as well. There is this famous episode which has been videotaped and seen millions of times by people on their smartphone, in which President Macron is talking to young people who say, "I cannot find a job." He said because he's the one specialized in tilling flowers and plants, etc. And President Macron just said, "Well, you have to cross the road and you find jobs in the next hotel and restaurant there." Because they are lacking this type of jobs. So it was kind of a scandal of the arrogant president towards this poor guy who just wanted to make a living out of his training. But essentially, it was not wrong. And you see, the migrants are productive, sometimes much more productive than the British. For those people who have visited England extensively, as I did, that many occasions, and you see that there are a lot of English citizens who do menial, trivial jobs, and they are not very productive, whereas the Indians, for example, do the same job in a more productive way, or Polish people, and Portugal, people coming from Portugal, probably mainly, etc. So there are structural reasons why this is not going to change. The United Kingdom in this hospitality business, and same with France and possibly Spain, etc., Italy, they will need a number of people coming from foreign countries and being mobile, and some of them will be, of course, illegal migrants. So this challenge is also possibly the source of a solution in the future. Now, last and probably not least, the seventh challenge, the seventh plague or seventh woe of the world, persistent inequalities. I mean, you know, progress was also a promise of putting an end to inequalities which were not grounded on differences in merit and diploma and training and capability. But by now, there are quite a number of people who are graduated, who are specialized, who would be hired and paid with a high salary in normal times, and they are not. So that's probably the most difficult challenge of the list. And we are sure that inequality grows. And here I have to warn you that, I mean, this is one of the way to look at the issue. Inequalities are growing worldwide. But that's relative inequality, meaning that the least affluent in any country of the world are separated from the richest by a larger gap than before. But the poorest today are more well off than they were, that their parents were in the past. So there are the two phenomena are actually very striking and impressive. I mean, on the one hand, the inequality is tremendously impressive and growing. On the other hand, the people who were at the bottom of the economic pyramid in the past are much more affluent by now than they were in the past, or their equivalents were in the past. So the problem is that if a country is populated by a lot of people who are in the lowest strata of the economic scale, that means that they feel deprived, they feel in a way unfairly treated, not recognized enough by other countries. I mean, it's a source of shame, and so being more equal, it would be a source of pride. And the Chinese sometimes use this argument, saying, you know, that in China compared to India, there is less inequality. Persistent inequality is visible on this graph, where you see that the top 10% income shares across the world during that period, 1980 2016, is visible, especially in the Middle East, and then India and Brazil. So the emerging countries, or the rising states, but China, are more and more unequal, and that goes, this inequality grows with this massive growth that they experience. But it's also the case with China in a way, and Europe on a milder rhythm, but in a way we can see that the depiction of the trends are quite similar. Stuart, I'm nearly finished. So I'm nearly finished. So I can take the whole bunch of questions as a package. So here is a very interesting curve. You see that what parts of the growth has been captured by the poor on the left and by the rich on the right. And as you see, the bottom 50% of the people in the world succeed in capturing 12% of the growth, whereas the top 1% capture 27% of the total growth. So that means that there is a large number of people, 90%, which are in the middle of the U curve, which in the northern part of the globe are unable to benefit from this growth, which of course is a source of a big debate about what the growth should be or should not be. And it will be becoming worse and worse in 2050 if nothing changes. If the US model is actually pregnant everywhere, it will be still worse than if it's the European model. But in the long run, if states and international organizations do not intervene, then this will be a source of trouble, strife, even civil wars or international wars, in the future. And here we are. Thank you.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. We've got about 5 minutes left. One question is about, to go back to pandemics, epidemics, whether you think that Taiwan's handling of SARS in 2003 helped it to handle the recent outbreak of COVID-19 better than other countries. And we saw this perhaps with Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan. They've done very well in terms of contact tracing, tracking, and keeping the number of fatalities to very low numbers.
Okay, very good question. Actually, the problem is that it can go in two different directions. Let me start from France. In France, we had the same experience of SARS-1 in 2003. And what happened was that we prepared for a shock, as probably we expected the current shock to be at the time, because it was still even more and it was not understood as it should have been, because it was quite new, this type of coronavirus, 2003. And then because we succeeded in 2003, as did the Taiwanese, because we succeeded in 2003, in 2019, we thought that, again, this virus would stop at the borders of France, and it would stop actually at the border of Asia. So you see two lesson drawings. One in Taiwan is that we have, in a way, rehearsed in 2003, and now on a larger scale, we are much more prepared to face a challenge which is bigger. Whereas in France, well, we have the experience of 2003, we succeed in 2003, we are going to succeed in 2019, which was not the case. So you must consider these two possible ways to draw lessons from the past. Now, the other aspect is that in these Asian countries, people are avoiding physical contact all the time. And of course, masks are part of this, but I mean, just having some distance with the other, you should not be in touch with others. And people who work on comparisons of the cultures in the world are having fun in giving the example of the Arabs who like to touch the other, physical contacts, the French who kisses each other every time they meet, and the people in Asia who are self-restrained and keep away from the other as far as they can. So there is this famous Shibuya crossing in Tokyo, which is an endless source of surprise for those who see the image every time they are talking about Japan and the mass population in the urban metropolitan area. And you see that these people manage to cross the streets without having any contact. And probably some even do not breathe while they cross the street, in order to make sure that it will not be a source of harm for any of their neighbors. So this is usual, and this is not the case in Europe. It's not the case even in the United States. So that means that probably this physical distancing, which is the norm between people in normal time, has more explanatory power than the type of tools you used to deal with the crisis at the very beginning.
Although, I mean, it's interesting about the cultural aspects, as you say, but say Hong Kong, Macau. I mean, Macau is one of the most densely populated places on the planet. And yet, as far as I've seen from the statistics, there have been no deaths at all in Macau, which I find I find quite incredible. I actually lived in Singapore during SARS, and I personally think that governments have learned the lessons from the SARS crisis, and basically they've taken it far more seriously, and the populations have taken things far more seriously than Europeans have or Americans.
I'm sure about that, but I mean, you see that my point was that you could also take the lesson in the other way around, and the wrong way, as the French did.
Well, and also in the UK, they had basically looked at plans in 2016, had made recommendations for making preparations for a pandemic, but never followed through.
Well, we also had the same in France.
Because of Brexit or whatever, but it was quite odd.
Well, there was this concern for a return for the money invested by the states, and so we had another episode in France, which is also very illustrative, is the H1N1 influenza crisis, because the Minister of Health at the time, following the recommendation from the WHO, decided to buy a billion doses of vaccines or 100 million of vaccines and a billion of masks. And so everything was absolutely wasted. I mean, it was destroyed after a while, because we were not struck by the H1N1 influenza pandemic as we had expected it to be. So the two aggregated, the SARS-1 and the H1N1, in the end, convinced the people in charge of these issues in France that we would overcome the new virus, whatever it would be.
Okay, and before we finish, there was just one other question, which was about the 7 plagues, the 7 new challenges, and whether you could really add overpopulation to this. And I suppose overpopulation is having impacts on some of the other issues that you mentioned, such as climate change, migration, and so on.
Yeah, inequality, etc. I mean, they all are in a way derived from the fact that there is too much there are too many human beings in some points, especially in cities. And the lessons that we are going to draw from this crisis is that people would like to live like in England. You know, people who work in London, who live, a number of them live in the countryside, and they just drive or take buses or trains to go and work. I mean, it's not like in the suburban area of Paris, which is very dense with high-rise buildings, etc. There is just countryside, like a typical British landscape, Gainsborough's type, etc. Not Gainsborough. The other painter of the same period. Well, never mind. It's not, I have it on the tip of the tongue.
Constable, I think you're thinking of.
See?
Constable.
Constable.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Constable.
Yeah. So, you know, Constable. So you live in a village like the one Constable depicted in his paintings. They are still nearly the same, and you work in the city of London. Well, now this is the model that we are going to adopt in France in a number of cities and probably elsewhere. So the concentration trend, which brought people to poor shanty towns type areas in cities like Istanbul, or of course in Rio and Sao Paulo, etc., is probably going to be affected by pandemics like this. I think that at least it's a hypothesis that we can make.
Okay, well, we're a few minutes over. I think we can wrap it up here. And the next session will be on Thursday, same place, same time.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Great session. Thank you.
Bye.